He walked into that bank believing it was just another meeting, another chance to prove what he'd already earned. His suit was pressed, his documents ready, his name on the schedule. But as minutes turned into hours, he began to realize this wasn't a delay. It was a message. Every smile that passed him, every person waved through those glass doors, said what no one dared to speak aloud. He didn't belong here. What happened next wouldn't just change one man's day. It would expose a truth too many still deny. He thought patience would earn him respect. But what waited behind those doors would test far more than his time. Dorian Bennett wasn't the kind of man easily overlooked. Every morning, he left his downtown apartment with quiet purpose. Polished shoes, crisp suit, a calm confidence that came from years of earning his place in rooms that weren't built for him. He had built his consulting firm from the ground up, turned late nights into contracts and rejections into lessons. Today wasn't supposed to be any different. A scheduled meeting at Highland Crest Bank. A loan review he was more than qualified for. The city buzzed outside, indifferent as ever. Inside the bank's glass doors, the air was cool, filtered, deliberate, designed to impress those it wanted to impress. Dorian checked his watch, right on time as always. He believed professionalism spoke louder than anything else. What he didn't know was that this time, no amount of preparation would change how they saw him. He thought this was just business, but the next few hours would remind him what kind of world he was really doing business in. At first, it seemed harmless, just a few extra minutes in the waiting area. Dorian took a seat by the window, the morning sun slicing across the polished marble floors. He glanced at the clock, 10:55. He was early, always was. But by 11:10, his confidence began to waver just slightly. The receptionist, Melissa, had promised he'd be called soon, her voice cool and detached, her eyes barely lifting from the computer screen. Soon. That word carried a tone he'd heard before. Polite, professional, but hollow. The kind of soon that never came. Across the lobby, he watched others walk in, men in tailored suits, women in crisp blazers. And within minutes, each was ushered to frosted glass doors that led to the executive offices. None of them had checked in as long as he had. None of them waited. By 11:30, the rhythm of the place became painfully clear. A white businessman arrived, exchanged a friendly nod with Melissa, and was greeted by a banker before he even had time to sit. Then a woman in a cream jacket appeared, chatting casually with the staff before disappearing into the same offices where his meeting was supposedly delayed. Dorian's jaw tightened. He wasn't naive. He'd been in enough rooms to know when something wasn't right. Still, he stayed calm, checked his watch again, and told himself there had to be a reason. Maybe a scheduling mix-up. Maybe Linda Kramer, the manager he was meeting, had been held up. But the longer he waited, the harder it became to convince himself of that. When the clock hit noon, an hour past his appointment, patience turned into something heavier. Dorian stood and walked back to the front desk. "Has Miss Kramer been told I'm waiting?" he asked, steady, controlled. Melissa didn't even look up at first, just typed something into her computer and replied, "She knows. She'll be with you soon." The words hit harder this time, not because of what she said, but because of how she said it. Dismissive, like he wasn't worth the effort of checking again. Behind her, laughter rose from a cluster of young bankers chatting near the offices. It wasn't directed at him, but it didn't have to be. The message was clear enough. He wasn't part of the space. Another woman walked in, a regular by the looks of it. Her tone was light, her confidence effortless. "Good morning, Mrs. Lancaster." Melissa greeted her with a warmth that hadn't existed minutes ago. Within seconds, a banker appeared to escort her to the back. No appointment, no waiting, just access. Dorian watched the exchange unfold like a silent performance he'd seen too many times before, the quick smiles, the unspoken hierarchy. It wasn't about policy. It was about perception, who looked like they belonged and who didn't. His heart rate stayed steady, but his chest tightened with a quiet anger. He sat back down, forcing himself to stay composed. Losing his temper wouldn't change anything. It never did. But sitting here quietly wasn't changing much either. Around him, the hum of conversation continued, polished and professional, as if nothing was wrong. He checked his phone, confirmed his appointment again. The email was there, time-stamped, undeniable. Yet that piece of proof meant nothing in this lobby where courtesy had limits. Then he overheard it. Two employees near the teller desk whispering about making exceptions for certain clients. Their laughter was low, careless, but the words cut deep. Exceptions. That's what this was about. The rules bent for some and stayed rigid for others. Dorian clenched his jaw, staring at the reflection in the glass doors across the room. He looked every bit the successful professional, clean-cut, confident, prepared. But to them, he was something else. Someone who could wait. Someone who didn't belong beyond that frosted barrier. An hour and a half. That's how long it took for his patience to fracture. He stood again, this time with intention. The receptionist started to speak, but he walked past her without a word. The glass doors opened easily under his hand. The quiet click of their hinges, sounding louder than anything else in the room. The hallway beyond was lined with offices, doors open. Executives chatting, not a single sign of a busy meeting in progress. And there she was, Linda Kramer, sitting at her desk, alone, typing, not in a meeting, not unavailable, just choosing to be. The moment she looked up, surprise flickered in her eyes, quickly replaced by irritation. She opened her mouth, but before she could speak, he took a seat across from her. Calm, steady but resolute, he'd been polite long enough. Now it was time for answers. He didn't know it yet, but what came next would expose more than rudeness or oversight. It would peel back the layers of system that thrived on quiet discrimination. And when the right people walked through that door, every mask in that office would start to crack. He thought walking in would finally give him a voice, but it was who walked in after him that would make them all listen. Linda's expression hardened the moment Dorian sat down across from her. The polished smile she reserved for preferred clients was gone, replaced with something cold and tight. She began to speak quickly, her words clipped, an apology that wasn't one, an excuse dressed as procedure. "We've been extremely busy today," she said, rearranging papers that didn't need rearranging. Dorian said nothing at first. He simply looked at her. The weight of his silence filled the room louder than any words could. Busy. That was the word she'd chosen. He'd watched half a dozen people stroll past him into offices that were supposedly full. But now that he was here face to face, the pretense cracked. Her voice trembled slightly as she continued, fumbling through the script of polite dismissal. "We'll need more assurances before we can proceed with your loan." It wasn't what she said, it was how she said it. That subtle condescension, the underlying belief that people like him were always one step short of trustworthy. Then the sound that would change everything. Footsteps. Firm, steady, commanding. The energy in the room shifted instantly as three men in dark suits entered, their presence magnetic, the kind that made everyone straighten a little taller. At the center was Richard Langford, the bank's CEO. His gaze swept the room before landing on Dorian. Recognition flashed in an instant. "Dorian," he said, voice sharp with surprise. Then came the smile, the handshake, the warmth that Linda had never offered. "What are you doing here?" The shift in Linda's face was almost imperceptible at first. The tightening jaw, the fading color. Dorian didn't rush to answer. He let the silence breathe, let the discomfort expand until it filled the space between them. "Had a meeting," he finally said, calm and measured. "Been waiting an hour and a half." The words hit harder than he expected. Richard's smile faltered. The executives behind him exchanged uneasy glances. Richard turned to Linda. "An hour and a half," he repeated, his tone deceptively soft. Linda stammered, reaching for excuses that dissolved as quickly as they formed. There must have been a mix-up. But Richard cut her off without raising his voice. "Was there?" The silence that followed was suffocating. Every second stretched, thick with realization. In that moment, Dorian didn't need to say anything else. The truth was already written across every uneasy face in the room. For the first time that morning, Linda seemed small, not because of Dorian's words, but because of the reflection she now saw of herself in them. She had built her authority on quiet bias, on assumptions that went unchallenged. Now those assumptions had a witness who mattered. Richard's demeanor changed entirely. "Step outside, Linda," he said, calm but final. The words landed like a gavel. She hesitated, eyes darting to Dorian as if searching for some hint of forgiveness. But he offered none. She gathered her things quickly, her one steady hands trembling as she left the room. When the door clicked shut, the sound echoed like the closing of a chapter. Richard turned back to Dorian, his voice laced with an apology wrapped in frustration. "This isn't how we do things here." But they both knew it was. It had always been. Dorian had seen it in countless forms, some loud, some silent, but it was all the same story told with different faces. The difference was, this time, he wasn't just another man being brushed aside. He was a name that carried weight, a story that could ripple beyond that bank's glass doors. Richard promised to make it right, to fast-track the loan, to address the issue internally. But Dorian wasn't sure right was something you could fix with paperwork. It wasn't just a delay or a mistake. It was a reminder of where he stood in their eyes. Respect wasn't the default. It had to be demanded, earned twice over, and still negotiated when others received it freely. The offer of approval came quickly, almost too easily. But as Richard spoke, Dorian realized this moment wasn't just about his business. It was about something larger. For every Dorian who had the power to confront it, there were hundreds who didn't, who waited quietly, who accepted the word soon as the cost of being seen. And as he stood to leave, briefcase in hand, he knew this meeting had already become something more than a transaction. It was a reckoning, one that wouldn't end with a handshake or an apology. He thought walking out with approval would bring closure, but what followed outside those glass doors would redefine what justice looked like. "Sir, you need to step away from the dock immediately." That was the first thing the cop said before he even looked at the paperwork in my hand. And honestly, I couldn't help laughing, because the whole situation was so upside down 3 months ago. I was just an ordinary guy named Rex Thornton, retired electrician from Denver, trying to figure out how to fill the silence my wife Claire left behind after cancer took her, and now here I was, standing on a mountain lake in Montana, being accused of trespassing. On water, I legally own. It all started when I bought this strange property listed as Lake Reserve parcel with territorial water rights. I didn't understand half of what that meant, but it sounded fancy, and after losing Clara, I just needed something new to pour my time into, so I took the plunge to drive to Pine Lake. It was like inhaling Freedom Mountain air pine scent, and that feeling of space that makes you forget city noise. When I pulled up, I found this little cabin tucked between million-dollar homes, all glass decks and perfect lawns, the kind of place where everyone has the same mailbox, and the HOA newsletter feels like the Constitution. I figured I'd be the quiet neighbor fixing up the dock, enjoying retirement. What I didn't know was that Delilah Whitmore, the HOA president, practically treated this lake like her personal kingdom. She showed up on day 2, clipboard in hand, perfume strong enough to stun wildlife, and a voice that sounded like customer service, mixed with a drill sergeant mister. "Thornton," she said, "this dock violates community standards." I told her the property was auction off clear title, but she just smiled that frozen smile and said standards, not rules. It was like being lectured by royalty. I ignored her, but a week later she came back with so-called inspector, who looked more like a discount handyman. The guy asked weird questions about water depth and wildlife, and something about unusual spring activity. My gut told me he wasn't legit, so I called the state office right there on speaker. They said they had no inspector named Dale. That man dropped his clipboard and ran to his truck faster than a raccoon caught in a spotlight. Delilah just stood there pretending it was all a misunderstanding. I could already tell she wasn't used to people standing up to her. A few days later, I got a fancy letter about an emergency HOA meeting claiming my purchase was illegal and threatening to sue me for damaging community resources. That's when Garrett Flynn showed up, local surveyor, part-time fishing guide, and apparently the only other person in town Delilah hated more than me. He said he'd been fighting her for years over his own boathouse. He took one look at my deed and whistled. "You realize what this is, right?" He told me those territorial rights weren't just legal fluff. They meant every drop of water feeding Pine Lake started on my land. The underground springs ran straight from my property into the entire lake system, meaning technically and legally I controlled the source. I thought he was joking until he showed me maps from the county office. Even the developers had missed it when they built those luxury houses. They never filed for water rights. All those fancy homes with exclusive lake access were basically freeloading off water that belonged to me. Suddenly, everything clicked. Delilah wasn't protecting property values. She was protecting her empire. Her real estate company made money promising private lake access. She couldn't legally guarantee a few nights. Later, my dock lines were cut. Next day, spray, paint across the planks. Calling me trespasser Garrett helped me install cameras. We caught her son Bradley sneaking around at night, talking on the phone about getting paid $2,000 for security work. I confronted him at the local coffee shop. Poor kid cracked faster than a cheap light bulb. He admitted Delilah had been paying him with HOA money to mess with my property and scare me off. She'd pulled the same stunt with other homeowners for years, forcing them to sell cheap, then flipping the houses for profit. I took that info straight to my lawyer, Maya Blackstone, who nearly spilled her coffee reading my documents. She said, Rex, you don't just own land, you own every bit of water feeding that entire lake. Those $1,000,000 homes depend on your springs. It was like realizing I'd inherited the keys to the whole kingdom. Maya came up with a plan. We filed legal notice requiring payment for water usage, but also offer an alternative cooperation and community fund in Clara's name. It would make me look generous while giving us leverage. When the letters went out, chaos hit the neighborhood like a thunderstorm. People called, screaming, threatening, demanding explanations. Delilah showed up at my door, hair frazzled, makeup cracked, offering $75,000 in cash to leave quietly. I recorded the whole thing. When I refused, she filed false police reports claiming I threatened her. That's how I ended up with Deputy Rodriguez at my door looking uncomfortable. Until I showed him the recording, she was done. He just nodded and said, seems like she's digging her own grave, Mr. Thornton. A few days later, the county posted official confirmation of my rights. The HOA bank account was frozen pending investigation, and Delilah faced charges for fraud and embezzlement. The funniest part was watching her try to explain on local news why the community pool had been shut down due to water restrictions. I didn't cut them off, but I could have. Garrett said, you just went from retiree to water baron in 3 weeks, but I wasn't interested in power. I started a conservation fund in Clara's memory, using fair usage fees from the lake residents. Now, even folks who once glare at me from their balconies wave when they see me fixing the dock, the same dock Uncle Jasper built decades ago. The water's still clear, the air still smells like pine and peace, and I finally feel like Clara would be proud that I turned chaos into something good. So when the cop told me to step away from the dock that day and Delilah watched from her deck, waiting for my arrest, all I could do was laugh, because I realized for the first time in my life the HOA queen who thought she owned everything was standing on water that legally belonged to me.